I think that, a lot of different cultural traditions have recognized that. And I think that, the folk medicine ideas in a lot of traditions, really points to specific fermented foods and beverages, that are prominent in different parts of the world as, sort of part of taking good care of ourselves.
Welcome back to another exciting episode of Grow Your Grass Off. This is where we present food for thought because it's really important to have good food for good thinking. And our guest today is an amazing author, practitioner, Sandor Katz. He is well known for his book on wild fermentation, or fermentation in general. I suppose you're an expert in that. We're really excited to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm so happy to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, welcome. Thank you. We're excited.
Yeah, it's amazing because, we love growing food, and you get to that point, I think, some seasons, and you're like, well, what am I going to do with all this stuff? And I'm sure you've seen that with people. And so preserving is another piece to that in the sequence. You're going to have abundance at some point. And so how do you deal with it? I've got some funny stories because my wife has been really into it, and she got your book actually. And so we got into that whole mindset of, okay, like, let's have probiotics and let's do this ourselves. And so we've got many an experiment that, it's like, is that ready? Is it not? It smells, strong, but I'm game for it. My stomach's pretty good, for that kind of stuff. So I always tested it and tried it. But we did have a few bottles that got too much pressure and then exploded. So I think that's all part of the process. So we didn't shy away. We kept going. We did kefir. We did different, things like kimchi, sauerkraut. She's got German heritage, so she loved the sauerkraut and the different sort of spices that go with that. But yeah, I just wanted to lead in with that story because I feel like it's such an important thing to, and I know you can unpack a lot of this stuff for us in a nice way, but that's kind of a funny part for me is that people feel like, it's like, I don't want to mess up. But for us, it's been a good journey, and so maybe you could talk about your background in that and just lead into kind of what you're inspired by.
Well, sure. I mean, let me just, first, before I talk about like myself and my own background, let me just talk a little bit broadly about fermentation. Because the reality is that like almost every person in almost every part of the world eats and drinks products of fermentation every day. Like these are not, I mean, certainly there exist ferments that might, that people never might have heard of because this is practiced in every part of the world, and each of us, exists in just one part of the world. And so there's, lots of things that probably people haven't heard of, but there's lots of ferments that are everyday foods for people that people would never think twice about eating. So, if you start your day with coffee, coffee is fermented. If you like bread, bread is fermented. If you like to put cheese on your bread, cheese is fermented. If you make a sandwich that involves, mustard or ketchup or mayonnaise, like, all of the condiments, all the contemporary condiments involve vinegar, which is fermented. And of course, the old world condiments like fish sauce and soy sauce, or, the condiments are themselves fermented. Chocolate is fermented, vanilla is fermented, obviously sauerkraut, but also, pickles and olives and, a whole world of related foods. So, an extraordinarily wide range of foods can be fermented. And we haven't even gotten into beverages. I mean, beer and wine and mead, kombucha, many other kinds of lightly fermented soft drinks. So there's like an incredibly varied world of fermentation, and people ferment everywhere because there's an inevitability to microbial transformation of our food. And because, fermentation just gives people so many practical benefits. I mean, fermentation is applied, as you mentioned, as a strategy for preserving seasonal food abundance. Fermentation can make food more digestible. It can make nutrients in food more easily bioavailable. contribute a probiotic, bacterial density to the food. It can create some special metabolic byproducts that have been found to have, a therapeutic benefit for us. So there's a lot of different kinds of benefits to fermentation. And I haven't even mentioned probably the most compelling one, which is that fermentation creates extraordinary flavors. Fermentation can be applied in all kinds of ways. As for me, my interest in fermentation really developed in a few discrete steps. I grew up in New York City. I was the grandchild of immigrants from Eastern Europe. I grew up eating pickles. I love the flavor of pickles, and the pickles that, my Eastern European family in New York was eating are the pickles that in New York are known as sour pickles. In the US outside of New York, they're often called kosher dills, but they're a style of pickle that never has vinegar added to it. It's always the acidity that preserves the cucumber develops through fermentation. So bacteria that are on the cucumbers already digest carbohydrates that are part of the cucumber into acids that enable the cucumber to be preserved. And so I just, without knowing anything about how these pickles were made, I grew up loving this particular lactic acid flavor of these pickles. Then, fast forward, I'm in my mid-20s, I started following a macrobiotic diet. I was experimenting with different dietary ideas, and macrobiotics places a lot of emphasis on the digestive benefit of pickles, miso, and other kinds of raw ferments. And I started noticing that, these pickles that I'd been eating my entire life, whenever I would bite into one, I could feel the salivary glands under my tongue squirting out saliva. And I really began to associate pickles and related foods with getting my digestive juices flowing in a quite literal way. But it really wasn't until I moved from New York to rural Tennessee, which is 30 years ago this year, that I had a practical reason to investigate fermentation. And the first season that I was gardening, we had a beautiful row of cabbages, and I was such a naive city kid that it had never occurred to me that in a garden all of the cabbages would be ready at about the same time, all of the radishes would be ready at about the same time. So, that first year when I was facing this abundance, I had this little light bulb went off, and I was like, I love sauerkraut, and I think that has something to do with preserving cabbage. I wonder how you make it. And I just opened up the joy of cooking, and I found a sauerkraut recipe. It was deceptively simple. You chop up vegetables, you salt them, add other seasonings if you like, get in there and pound or squeeze the vegetables to, speed up the salt releasing juices. And then once the vegetables are juicy, you pack them into your vessel, whether it's a jar or a crock or some other barrel, so that the vegetables are submerged. And then that's a protected environment where the lactic acid bacteria will dominate every single time and, make things nice and sour so that they're able to preserve effectively and, most importantly, safely. Because, you sort of alluded to this, but, in our time, because we've been taught to be so fearful of bacteria, these processes that are, they're time tested, that, people have been using for millennia to enhance their food, we've become afraid of them. We project all of our anxiety about bacteria onto the idea of cultivating bacteria in a jar or a crock. And so, I just remember so vividly the first time I taught a sauerkraut making workshop, which was 1998. This young woman held up a jar of the vegetables we had just shredded, and she had this very worried look on her face. And her question was, how can I be sure I have good bacteria growing in here and not some dangerous bacteria that might make me sick or even kill someone? And it's just so easy for people to project this kind of anxiety onto processes that have been used forever because they are so safe. Do you know that sauerkraut is about as safe as food gets? I mean, in the United States, we have no case history, no reports of illness or food poisoning from fermented vegetables. Like, vegetables become much safer, statistically speaking, after you ferment them than they were in their raw state. Fermentation above all else is a strategy for safety. So anyway, I went on a million tangents there. I don't even remember where I was, like, introducing myself, telling my story, but that's how I got interested in all this. I got invited to teach. Teaching forced me to do some more reading so I could answer people's questions better. And then that led me into writing first a little self-published zine, and then my book, Wild Fermentation. And then since then, I've written other books, The Art of Fermentation, Fermentation Journeys, Fermentation as Metaphor. Turns out there's a lot to say about fermentation.
There is. I just ordered your book, so I'm excited to dabble into that. I have a little bit of experience with fermenting, just pickles and carrots, and excited to try cabbage this year. Growing a bed of it back in my orchard, trying to keep it safe from the deer. And so that's my next journey, is to start fermenting some sauerkraut here. I do take a bite of sauerkraut each day. Trader Joe's has an amazing one. I don't know if you guys have Trader Joe's where you are, but I love it. It's got pickles and sauerkraut, and it is so good. Like you said, your glands in your mouth just juices. So I love it. I'm a big fan, and a big fan to see what you have to offer. So it's exciting.
Hey, the one other thing I want to add, just because it seems like, sort of part of the focus of your podcast is growing stuff, having a garden, producing food, for yourself in your yard or your window or wherever. And I would just point out that, the garden is a manifestation of fermentation, and people have compost piles where they take their scraps from the kitchen and scraps from the garden, and encourage bacterial and fungal processes to break that down into humus to feed soil fertility. So fermentation is not applied exclusively in the realm of food and beverages. I mean, it's really at the core of all traditional gardening and farming practices. And it's really in the cycle of life, fermentation is hugely important for basically recycling animal waste and dead plant material back into elemental forms that can nourish and sustain further life. So it's really an essential part of the cycle, whether we choose to tap into it and make use of it or not.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point.
I have something behind me I have to just stir. I'll be right back.
Love it.
It's a great kitchen setup.
I know.
Awesome.
It looked like it was
I'm actually trying something experimental. And so I'm sure you all have heard of miso, which is a Japanese fermented bean paste. But the starter for miso is koji, which is a Japanese word for rice or barley or soybeans or other things with a particular fungus, Aspergillus oryzae, growing on it. And what I am attempting to make today is a tomato miso, where I'm cooking down tomatoes with a little bit of onion and garlic into a paste, and then I'll cool that off and mix it with koji and salt and ferment it for several weeks, and try to make a tomato miso, and we'll see how that goes.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I got a follow-up question on that thread that you were pulling on there for a minute. It's kind of tying together the inner biome to the sort of, like you said, the outer biome, which I think it's so as above, so below kind of concept where, I feel like what you touched on there to me is the reflection saying that it's really a process of life, that things are eating other things, and that whole process is unfolding sort of this beautiful, you know, connectedness that we all kind of partake in. So no matter where you are in that whole thing, you're playing your part, you know. And so I guess I'm trying to tie it back to the idea of the biome, the gut biome in particular, like the nutrition standpoint. Can you touch on that a little bit? Because I know that's definitely a part of it. It seems that
Yeah,
this
sure.
process, yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, when you're thinking about our gut biome, like, where is it coming from? Like all bacteria really are, coming from the earth, coming from the soil. If we want to think in terms of evolution, there is a, broad consensus that all life is descended from archaea and bacteria and other, single-celled prokaryotic organisms. And that it is sort of like the union of various prokaryotic organisms. Prokaryotes are single-cell organisms where the genetic material is not bound in a nucleus. It's free-floating in the cell. What we and animals and plants and fungi are composed of are cells that are called eukaryotic cells, where our genetic material is in a nucleus. And so, most of the thinking at this point about how eukaryotic cells, which were created much later than prokaryotic cells, but that they were formed by a union of prokaryotic cells and became this more complex, specialized kind of cell, the eukaryotes. And so the earliest forms of life in the world were bacteria and other single-celled organisms. They essentially gave birth to the type of cells that became multi-cell organisms such as ourselves. But none of the multi-cell organisms have ever lived without single-cell organisms. So as they sort of created more and more complex amalgams, the amalgams, such as ourselves, have always incorporated bacteria and other single-cell organisms. And so, we've learned that we are utterly dependent upon bacteria, the, trillions of bacteria that each of us is host to. But so too is the cabbage and the soybean and the wheat plant. They have their own communities of microorganisms that they are host to and to various degrees are dependent on. So, we all sort of have emerged out of this, primordial soup of, bacteria and other prokaryotic forms of life, and we all function with the assistance of the communities that we are host to. And where these organisms come from, I mean, theoretically, babies are born sterile. There's a lot of questions about this idea, but that's been the traditional model. And then they begin to be cultured by bacteria, basically like during birth is their first culturing, like on their mother's breast continues that culturing. The infants, constant need to explore the world by putting everything into their mouths. That's, part of the sort of developing bacterial complexity of the gut. But the bacteria come from many places, including the food that we eat. And, there are a lot of factors in our modern lives that, are having the effect of diminishing biodiversity in the gut where we need it. And, some of those factors are chemical exposure, whether it's to, antibiotic drugs, antibacterial cleansing products, a lot of agricultural chemicals, herbicides and such. So, lots of different chemical exposures that really at this point, there's no way for like an individual to avoid them. They are just so systemic at this point that we're all exposed to, many of these chemicals that have the effect of diminishing our gut bacterial diversity. In addition, our diets. I mean, compared to our ancestors, we just all eat a lot less fiber. Fiber really is food for the bacteria in the far reaches of our digestive system. So that's diminishing biodiversity, or the lack of fiber in most of our diets. There's various strategies that people have to try to restore biodiversity, but eating traditional biodiverse fermented foods is one great strategy for doing that.
Yeah, I was just saying, piggybacking off of that, that's how we produce ATP or energy in our body. Whether there's oxygen or no oxygen present, we're going to have pyruvic acid, or we're going to have lactic acid, which is basically fermentation of those sugars. So
I mean, fermentation happens in our bodies. If you my working definition of fermentation, because I'm mostly working with foods and beverages, is I would describe fermentation as the transformative action of microorganisms. If you ask a biologist, they're going to have a different story. And biologists will typically explain that fermentation is anaerobic metabolism, the production of energy without oxygen. And mostly our bodies function under respiration. And that's the most efficient way for our cells to produce energy. Is we have this elaborate system that carries oxygen through our blood to every cell in our bodies, and that's mostly how they function. But sometimes we might exert ourselves, like lifting something really heavy, going really fast, and we are demanding of cells in certain muscles of our bodies at those points that they produce more energy than we're providing them oxygen to produce. So they revert to this alternative mode that the cells of our bodies possess of anaerobic metabolism, fermentation. And when they're functioning under fermentation, they produce this byproduct, which is what makes it less efficient. And that byproduct, as you said, is lactic acid. And when we experience a little like burning sensation in our muscles, that's the lactic acid. But also, lactic acid is widely used in food fermentations. It's what makes, cheddar cheese sharp. It's what makes kimchi sharp. A lot of sour flavor foods are flavored by, this same metabolic byproduct, lactic acid.
Do you have any beginner tips for anyone who's starting out, preserving their own food, like just a beginner dish? Would it be sauerkraut? Would it be, what would be a beginner dish?
Yeah, sure. I think fermenting vegetables is the way to start. And I think, the sauerkraut method, generically called the dry salting method, mostly because you're not adding water. You're shredding the vegetables. Ultimately you need to get them submerged to protect them from the steady flow of oxygen. But rather than adding water to do that, you salt them and let the salt draw the water out of the vegetables, and you just get a beautiful concentrated flavor from that. The process just couldn't be simpler. To the degree that people might be projecting anxiety onto the process, like food does not get safer than sauerkraut. Like, eating a salad is more dangerous than eating sauerkraut. So it has everything to recommend it. Some ferment, like, miso could take months. Sauerkraut, you can really start tasting it in less than a week. I mean, it hasn't reached its full potential in a week, but you don't have to wait for it to reach its full potential to start enjoying it. And there is a huge subjective component to this. Like, when is something ready? You're going to have to decide. A recipe could give you a rough guideline, but let's say we said 3 weeks for sauerkraut. I mean, what temperature is it in your kitchen? It's not the same temperature in everybody's kitchen. And, the warmer the temperature, the faster the metabolism of these bacteria, and the faster the acidity will accumulate. And then, not everyone's after the same endpoint. So, right now I have some radish kraut that I made last October, and now it's August, so it's 10 months old. It's delicious, but like it's extremely sour. People who like, I don't know if I like sauerkraut are not going to like it. It's for the people who are like fully embracing the sour flavor. And, some people might be much happier with it if they had stopped after 3 weeks or a month. So, there is a subjective component to this, how sour do I like it? And, not everybody will have the same answer for that.
I got a
Makes
question
sense.
about sort of the fad of probiotics in the stores. I'm wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit in terms of the science. Is there really the strains that are needed? Do they last? Are they, because it seems like I've got a friend here in Costa Rica who's into kombucha and he has his own company, and just the idea of sometimes they're almost pasteurized, in the process of sort of production. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to like, are these products really giving a benefit for us that we can say is healthier,
Well, first of all, as a consumer of fermented products, not all products are the same. Like as some brands of kombucha are pasteurizing and then, introducing some very specific strains of bacteria. And many, especially smaller, locally distributed brands are not pasteurizing. So, to my mind, you're going to get a lot more biodiversity out of a kombucha that was never pasteurized. The whole field of probiotics, I just have to say, is very, very controversial. And the honest answer is like, we don't know that much. It's only the last 20 some years that microbiology has had the ability to study communities of bacteria as opposed to singular bacterium in a petri dish. So it's just it's an emerging field, and there's a lot of dogma, there's a lot of contradictions. I don't know. A few weeks ago, I read an article about a study that suggested that probiotic therapy, taking, capsules or liquids or, whatever the mode of dispensing is, that have like high concentrations of one or just a couple of strains of bacteria, might actually be counterproductive and diminish biodiversity in the gut rather than encourage it. I think, the reality is that like, we do not have, all of the answers. Personally, and I am not a microbiologist and I am not a clinician. I'm a guy who loves fermented foods, and I've learned a certain amount about them. But personally, I think you get much. You might get much better, probiotics in the sense of biodiversity if you just eat traditional fermented foods that haven't had anything specific added to them, but haven't had anything specific taken away. So, the title of my first book about fermentation is Wild Fermentation. And this is not a phrase that I made up. This is a phrase that's found throughout the literature, and it describes fermentation based on the organisms that are present in the food you are fermenting. So, okay, just to illustrate this concept, traditional winemaking, there was not a thing called yeast until the 20th century. Yeast is on all grapes, yeast is on all grains, yeast is on all fruit, yeast is everywhere in our environment, but it was never like a singular thing. Like now we understand yeast to be a particular fungus, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and laboratories all around the world propagate this, and in every supermarket you can buy a little packet of yeast that you could like rise a loaf of bread in 2.5 hours. Wild fermentation would be you work with the yeast that's on the wheat or the rye that you're fermenting. If you're making wine, it would be wine made with the yeast along with the bacteria that happens to be on the grapes. or on the apples. When you're making sauerkraut, you're not adding a little packet of starter, you're relying on the bacteria that are present on the cabbages, or if you're making pickles, on the cucumbers, like whatever it is that you're fermenting. And so, this just inevitably leads to a certain amount of biodiversity, because in the natural world, organisms are never singular. They always exist in these communities, and traditional fermented foods all are embodiments of these communities of bacteria. And over the course of the life of the ferment, the composition of the community will shift. So, in sauerkraut, as bacteria are metabolizing carbohydrates into lactic acid and creating an increasingly acidic environment, what that does is it causes some of the bacteria to die from excessive acidity, but it encourages other ones to propagate more rapidly, because they are healthier in the more highly acidic environment. So, the composition of the community is shifting as the ferment is developing, but there's always going to be biodiversity.
Awesome.
Well said.
Yeah. Have you seen a lot of health benefits for yourself? It seems like you started off early, so maybe you don't have something to compare it to, but
I mean, this is the thing, is like, everybody eats fermented foods every day. Nobody is just first introducing fermented foods into their diet. Now, maybe they have no experience with live fermented foods. Maybe it's all been like, bread and individually sliced pieces of cheese, or just more highly processed things. But I doubt that there's a person on the planet who just like has no experience eating fermented foods, because they are so thoroughly integral to people's diets. I mean, all the time I meet people, they hear what I do and they make a face. And they're like, oh, I hate fermented foods. Like, because they're probably thinking like, oh, one time I tried kimchi and that was like too strong for me, or like, oh, that Roquefort cheese that somebody served me. That people often, they hear fermentation, they think of like the strongest flavored fermented thing they've ever eaten, but they're not really thinking about like the chocolate bar that they ate yesterday, or the cup of coffee that they drank this morning, or the sort of English muffin that they were eating. But so many of the just mundane everyday foods that people are eating are products of fermentation. But I mean, I all the time, I'm sure since my wild fermentation came out 20 years ago this year, I'm sure that I have received hundreds of emails telling me that, like, people who started incorporating live fermented foods into their diet, whether it's, sauerkraut or yogurt or lightly fermented beverages. But, many people experience like dramatic improvements in their health. And, digestion is what I hear the most about. People who were suffering from chronic digestive problems, ranging from, constipation to acid reflux, more serious things like irritable bowel syndrome. But, a lot of people who have just experienced digestive distress for many years start incorporating foods like this and find that their digestion improves, and that the symptoms that they were having get much better. A lot of people with immune issues, there's a lot of evidence that, eating live culture foods can stimulate greater immune function. And so, that's another thing that I've heard a lot of stories about. And, and there's also great evidence in terms of like, structured clinical trials, really confirming this idea. And, the other thing that we've been hearing a lot about in recent years is the potential for live fermented foods, and or probiotic therapy to potentially improve mental health. And there was an insight about 10 years ago that one of the ways that our bodies produce serotonin is bacteria in the gut. And so, sometimes by diversifying bacteria in the gut through diet, people find that, their mental health is improving.
Well, yeah, you feel better. I mean, just having myself history with gut issues and then just eating clean for the last probably 5 years, no gluten or anything like that, because I suffered from stomach issues and irritable bowel and never knowing what the problem was. But once you take control over your gut, and it really takes control over your health, mentally, physically, I think everything is all controlled there in our tummy. So I'm a true believer in that. Just being a nurse, and Ian, he's a doctor, and just all of this scientific makes total sense of mental health, physical health. It all comes, I think, back to the tummy, really.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
It's cool.
So, I mean, eating well and, figuring out what foods make you feel good. I mean, I certainly don't want to be like saying like the same solutions apply to everyone and all you have to do is eat sauerkraut and all your problems are going to go away. However, it's not going to hurt you to try eating some sauerkraut, and maybe some of your problems will improve. But I think that, as you alluded to, the larger thing is, just sort of like feeling like, there are things you can do for yourself, and part of that is like, something you can make and you can eat that will make you feel better. And part of it is just trusting how you feel, your subjective evaluation of, what's making you feel good. And I think that that's hard for a lot of people.
I've got one more burning question. Have you looked at Zach Bush's work, and kind of maybe you could speak to that? Because it seemed like that's kind of it's almost the second mind that we have, right? Like you just said, it helps you think clearer. But I think I've seen and read different things where, you've got your mind, but the gut is just as much an intelligent system. Do you want to go into that a little bit at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm vaguely aware of Zach Bush, but I certainly have not read his books, and I mean, I'm in a different lane, I mean, I'm really not like, I do not have like an overarching view of like human health and, what we need to do to feel better. I mean, I certainly have like, my own ideas about that, and food obviously is a huge part of it, but I don't think food is like the whole thing. I don't think that just adding one food to your diet changes everything. I mean, it could change a lot, but the rest of your diet is still there. And I think for many of us, that's that's really a lifelong process of like learning what makes us feel good. But I mean, what I'm mostly doing is just teaching people how to make fermented foods. And I'm evangelical about fermented foods because I think that they're great and they taste great and they're practical and they're extremely beneficial for us in a number of ways. I'm more like an advocate for fermented foods than sort of like have an overarching theory of human health. But I think fermented foods, really fit in well to a picture of good human health. And I think that a lot of different cultural traditions have recognized that. And I think that the folk medicine ideas in a lot of traditions really points to specific fermented foods and beverages that are prominent in different parts of the world as sort of part of taking good care of ourselves. Probiotics is one aspect of it, the bacteria in the food, but it's certainly not the whole story. So, let's think about gluten and bread. Bacterial fermentation process breaks down gluten. A well-fermented sourdough bread has a lot less gluten than bread made from the same flour with a packet of yeast. And, you know, I've talked to celiac people who have learned techniques for making bread that they can eat because it breaks down enough of the gluten. But, you know, pre-digestion, you know, this idea is part of pre-digestion, and all fermented foods are pre-digested, meaning that, you know, nutrients in the foods that you start out with are broken down over the course of the fermentation by bacteria and other microorganisms like fungi. And so for instance, you know, like soybeans. You really never hear about people eating a big bowl of soybeans for dinner, even though soybeans are considered to be the plant food with the most concentrated protein. And the reason is that our human digestive systems cannot access the protein in a soybean that has simply been cooked. And, you know, the Asian cultures that developed soy agriculture thousands of years ago observed this about the soybean, and they developed all of these different ways of fermenting the soybean to make the nutrients more accessible. So there's so many different forms of fermented soybeans. There's tempeh, the Indonesian style, there's soy sauce, there's miso, there's natto, which is a Japanese style. But, you know, there's all these different methods of fermenting soybeans. They involve different organisms in some cases, different methodologies, different periods of time. But what they all have in common is that the protein gets broken down into amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, over the course of the fermentation. This is pre-digestion. The idea that, you know, dense compound nutrients get broken down into simpler, more elemental, and generally more easily accessible forms, you know, over the course of a fermentation.
I love how you're able to process it and deliver that message, because it is something that's so integral to our life. And I think that's part of what I've learned today, you know, is that, you know, it's a reminder for all of us, right? Is that we, yeah, let's not remove ourselves. It kind of brings me back to that, you know, let's plug in, stay together with the concept of, yeah, just that theory of being holistic more. And I think that's kind of what permaculture brings as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I'll say when I got obsessed with fermentation, one of the best books that I was able to find in the early years was actually Bill Mollison's book about fermentation, the Permaculture book of Ferment and Human Nutrition. And, you know, it's really an extraordinary compilation from, you know, I mean, well, one thing I learned about Bill Mollison reading that book is like, he was not actually making those foods, but he did an enormous amount of traveling, and he was extraordinarily curious and talks to people. So even if he never made these things, he was taking notes about what people told him about how they were making different fermented foods and beverages. And I think he really, you know, kind of keyed into, you know, this pattern that he saw in different cultures all around the world, you know, just that, you know, fermentation is an integral part of how people everywhere make effective use of whatever kind of food resources they have. And, you know, the objective is not always preservation. Nobody's ever fermented a grain or a bean in order to preserve it, because, you know, these foods that mature dry, it's very easy to store them as long as you have a way to keep them dry. And the first step of fermenting them is always introducing water. So just like the head of cabbage or the, you know, bucket of raw milk have their, you know, sort of indigenous community of microorganisms that will, you know, transform it over time, the beans and the grains also do. It's just that because of their dryness, the thing that preserves them forces the organisms that are on them to go into a state of dormancy. So, you know, most bacteria will not die of thirst the way we will. If, you know, if they dry up, then they just go into a state of sort of suspension, dormancy. But then, you know, as soon as you introduce water, they can come alive again, just like a seed.
Awesome. I love that. You guys have any other questions?
No, it's been a pleasure. A wealth of knowledge for sure.
Yeah,
Let
thank you,
us-
Sandor.
Yeah, can you let our listeners know, showcase where your books, how they can find you, workshops, education, website?
Great. So my website is wildfermentation.com, and you can find information about my books on there. You can find information about workshops that I teach. And you'll find links to all kinds of fermentation related resources on there. So yeah, check out my website, wildfermentation.com. My books, Wild Fermentation is what I would recommend to most people who are just sort of beginning their fermentation journey. It's very practical, hands-on, how to do things, how to make various ferments. My more in-depth book is The Art of Fermentation. It's about a 500-page book. It's also full of practical information, but it has a lot more microbiology in it. It has more of the sort of anthropology of different cultural fermentation traditions. It has everything you need to make things also, but some people just starting out have found it to be a little bit too much information. But if you're hungry for information, it's packed with information. And my latest book is called Fermentation Journeys, and it's about fermented foods and beverages that I've learned about in my ongoing travels. Most of my time I spend teaching about fermentation. Some of it is, in online venues such as this, and some of it is in, in-person workshops. I live in Tennessee. Some of them are here, but then some of them are in faraway places. But my website, wildfermentation.com, is the portal to learn more.
Fantastic. Well, we really appreciate you, what you're doing, and it's been fun to learn and get back into that mode of, just being curious. I think we love that.
Well, great. Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
Thank you.